Well, good afternoon, everybody. As Erica said, my name is Yoni Barkan, and I am the Global Head and VP of Product and Innovation for Appirio. First of all, welcome to the Flowsome Salesforce DevOps Summit. I am excited to welcome you to my talk on the culture of DevOps. And I'm really excited to be here, and I want to thank Flowsome for this wonderful opportunity to participate in the summit. As an organization that helps companies implement DevOps best practices and build DevOps tools, we're asked a lot, especially now, why DevOps and why now? With all that's going on, why should we be thinking about DevOps? And right off the bat, I want to let you know that now is exactly the right time to pay attention to DevOps. We've seen massive changes in the way that we work. Many of those changes were forced upon us. Some were good, some were not. So, number one, we're in this period of flux. There is immense change all around us. And one of the things that DevOps can teach us is that change is a constant. It teaches us to embrace change and embrace agility. The second thing is when it comes to Salesforce, we've always needed new ways of working. And this period of disruption gives us a unique opportunity to make that kind of change happen. And last, we need to find ways to empower our, unfortunately, and potentially smaller teams to do more than ever before. So before we get started into the culture of DevOps, we first have to understand and level set on what DevOps is, and most importantly, how it's relevant to the Salesforce ecosystem. The textbook definition of DevOps is that it's a combination of practices and tools that automate development and IT processes to improve products at a faster pace with continuous building, testing, and release management. And that's great. And that's a very perfect definition, but there's something more important to call out. DevOps is all about acceleration. It's about accelerating the pace of innovation, and not just the pace, but the pace of innovation without sacrificing trust. On one side, you have the developer, and on the other side, you have IT processes meant to sustain an application and protect your business stakeholders, users, and customers. However, DevOps is not just about enabling the process, but enabling the mentality and culture that encourages innovation. The benefits of DevOps, and we're going to hear today about a lot of different benefits of DevOps, but they do not necessarily come from new tooling, but in the way that DevOps principles transform an organization's perspective on innovation, risk aversion, and even inclusiveness. Now, DevOps is not new. It has a rich, robust, and respected ecosystem of tools and processes, but it's only recently gained traction within Salesforce. And there are some really important reasons for that. And some of them are linked intrinsically to the cultural challenges we face in adopting DevOps. When we think of DevOps, we need to focus on the flow of change from ideation through developers and into production. And again, it's not just the process, it's how we participate in this process, how we ideate, and who gets to ideate as part of this process. In the wider ecosystem, there are typically 4 core elements that we think of that characterizes DevOps: version control, automation, reproducible environments, and probably most importantly, code as the source of truth. Now, what is the cultural impact of this? How does this change who we are as developers? And I'm going to come back to this idea a little bit later in more depth, but currently we think very monolithically about Salesforce. We think in terms of orgs and environments, and that makes us very risk averse. But when code becomes the source of truth, when we get immediate feedback on the work that we do, when we are able to easily stand up reproducible and disposable environments that are a safe place for us to work, our approach to development fundamentally changes. Now, that leads us to one of the biggest changes we have in leveraging, or biggest challenges we have in leveraging standard DevOps processes within the Salesforce ecosystem. Code couldn't be the source of truth. We can't or couldn't change our orgs into code and make copies directly from that code. Now, Salesforce was built on the notion that your production org was the source of truth and that all sandboxes or development environments are based on a reproduction of your production environment. And Salesforce recognized this and started to adjust their infrastructure to support DevOps within their ecosystem. Now, there is a lot that we could talk about and that we could dive into here in terms of how Salesforce adapted to this paradigm. With Salesforce DX or SFDX, they created a framework based on new APIs and new metadata formats that enable us to think of code as the source of truth. And furthermore, they created scratch orgs, and scratch orgs are those disposable environments based on your code repo that enable developers to create environments quickly with very, very little overhead. If you put all of this together, you end up with a technology stack with version control in your center and scratch orgs and developer sandboxes as the basis for new development, with automated testing tied into everything that we do. Now, there's a lot that we could talk about when it comes to the technology and tools that drive DevOps, but I want to focus on the cultural shifts that are needed to enable DevOps in your organizations. Because culture isn't tools, it's how we use these tools. So I mentioned this before, but there are some cultural challenges with how we think about development in Salesforce that needs to be called out. The first is that we think monolithically. The second is that we avoid risk and experimentation, mainly because of the pain and cost of deployments, let alone rollbacks. And third, we are typically really suspicious of release automation. So we wait and only push in big chunks. Now, when we say we think monolithically, we think of our orgs as one solid unit rather than separate independent parts. And this increases complexity, technical debt. It captures us into a what if scenario. It always makes us think about that, makes us hold on to the reins of our orgs too tightly, and forces us into a one-track mindset. And this in turn leads to risk avoidance and limited experimentation. Now, we've all struggled with the pains and costs of deployments and as I said, worse, rollbacks. But this only makes us more risk averse. It's too costly and complex to try out new ideas in safe places. So we discourage experimentation and innovation and focus on top-down planning, excluding a lot of smart people from being part of the execution of innovation. And we end up lagging behind the pace of innovation that not just Salesforce sets, but is actually necessary for our businesses to grow. Now, finally, due to the complexity of the platform and the perceived or real potential limitations, we're suspicious of automation. If it takes me 8 hours to do a deployment with 100 manual steps, how could we possibly automate any of that? Now, years without real DevOps in Salesforce has led us to distrust automation, but we don't have those limitations anymore. And now is the time that we can actually change things. These are the things that have held us back, but DevOps is a way that we can break free and in turn shift so much about how we actually work. So as I said, DevOps is an opportunity to break out of this trap. The ability to respond to customer demands and the rate of innovation that DevOps enabled in the wider software industry didn't just come from cool scripting and fancy tools. Now, there's a lot of factors. However, a few core principles and their cultural side effects are specifically relevant to Salesforce. So in DevOps, the idea is that environments must be cheap to create and disposable, that code must be the source of truth, and that change must be continuous. These are those core principles that are going to drive a lot of the cultural and mental shifts that we're going to talk about. Now, when our environments are cheap and we're not afraid to just throw them away, it becomes easier to experiment. When we trust in code for what is true, it becomes easy to capture, manage, and control the flow of change. Now, there is something truly unique about the Salesforce platform. It's not only developers that drive innovation. Declarative development is crucially important to how we build on the Salesforce platform. And declarative developers, app builders, BAs, and admins need to be a part of the DevOps culture. All of these people drive innovation. In fact, I would argue that it is just as important, if not more important, than custom development. If you look at the list of metadata that we define in our orgs, those things that we think of as, pure development or for developers is a small percentage. Declarative changes, declarative developments needs to be thought of as first class. We have to embrace our low code and no code developers, and we must not think of them as second class citizens in this process. As I said at the beginning, DevOps has a rich ecosystem and something that has been around for many, many years, but it's only recently, within the last few years, come to the Salesforce ecosystem. So sometimes we have to look outside of Salesforce to get inspiration and to get information that we can leverage as a way to drive our own innovation. I'm particularly fond of this article by Angel Riviera at Circle CI about how DevOps didn't exist when he started as a developer, but the principles that he learned changed his perspective. And he has some conclusions and insights that I think are worth sharing here. Now, he tells his journey and ends up defining what he thinks DevOps is and what it's not. And we'll get to that in a moment. These definitions or ideas are critical, that they are key concepts that we have to embrace as we move forward, and we have to bring these ideas into our development methodologies and processes. And I think we can summarize all of these concepts, all of these things about what DevOps is, how you can define it, if we call it a growth mindset. With DevOps, we have to learn new things. We have to be willing to fail fast, and we have to grow as developers. Now, I'm not here to talk about the exact benefits of DevOps. I'll leave that to different presentations and we can talk about it, but there's no doubt that a key benefit is a reduction in the cost of deployment. By forcing developers to check code earlier in the process to ensure code is tested thoroughly, we force ourselves to address these challenges earlier in the process where it's cheaper to fix the problem. Now, some may take it negatively that it is a burden to fix the issue, but this is actually one of the biggest benefits, failing fast. You'll be forced to fix something now rather than later. The cost of fixing that something is in development is significantly cheaper, but not just because of time and resources, but the mental cost of the developer. And that's even more, what's even better than that is that this becomes an opportunity to grow, start seeing your errors earlier, start improving, start learning, and this constant feedback loop encourages growth. So we'll have some ideas of what DevOps is, but when we start to think about what DevOps is not, right? DevOps technology and a lot of the things you see on the screen are a means to the end. It is a goal to that, the goal is to change the way that we work and the way that we think about our work. But the tools we depend on just enable that. They're not the definition of these things. They're just simply the tools that we enable to change the way we want to work. If you focus on these elements, you're not going to be successful in introducing DevOps. You're going to be looking at the trees instead of the forest. These are critical elements, but they're just part of the process. My favorite one on this slide, by the way, and one of these is the last one, that DevOps is not to be trifled with. to me, I think that actually really sums up a lot of the ideas of the complexity, both from a cultural and mental perspective, but also from a technology perspective. Now, I've already said that DevOps is not the tool chain. It's not the stack that I showed at the beginning of the slides. It's an opportunity to improve how we work. DevOps principles provide the foundation to create a culture that encourages and incentivizes mentorship and collaboration, inclusion, and the empowerment. These elements, these are the drivers of innovation. DevOps and our technology makes them possible, but we don't get them for free. We have to work at it. So how do we start this transformation? There are four-ish core pillars to a transformation of your DevOps culture. First, you really need to take this personally. You have to be loud and persistent. Change is an incredibly difficult thing, and there is significant resistance to change at many levels of an organization, from leadership levels down to an individual developer not wanting to change the process or not wanting to learn new technologies or new capabilities. In some cases, our developers have grown up in a Salesforce ecosystem where they didn't need to know Git or didn't need to know version control. And that is a big change and a big leap for a lot of our developers and a lot of the people that we work with. And secondly, the ROI that comes from enabling a DevOps culture may not be immediately visible, and it may take a little while to see this impact, so we have to be persistent. Second, you have to be inclusive. You have to ensure that the process includes all of your app builders, all of your BAs, all of your admins, as well as your core developers. It's that group that makes up the core group of innovators. I can't emphasize that point enough. So often when we think of DevOps, we think solely of the developers, of the people who understand the command line, of those who have previously understood Git. But in the Salesforce ecosystem, that's just not the way the world works. You have declarative development, and it is crucially important that those individuals and those contributors are a part of this broader process. Third, you have to be strategic. You have to crawl before you walk, and you have to walk before you run. You can't just start with your production environment and just start, install DevOps tools and just get moving. You have to start with a subset of code, start with a small independent project, something that is easy to tackle, something that you can learn from, something that you can iterate through, something that you can apply not just the technology processes, but these cultural items, these mental issues, these mental ideas to the project. So start small and grow from there. Now, when you think about the technology, there's a lot of different viewpoints, a lot of different ways that you could approach this. But the simplest thing is to start from the base of your stack and work your way up. You can't just jump into automation. You need to start with version control, maybe developer tools, and then work up to a really robust CI/CD process or deep innovation, or deep automation, excuse me. Now, I want to just, as we kind of start to wrap up, I want to leave you with a few closing thoughts. One is that, as I said, DevOps is about the growth mindset. It's a journey, it's not an end state. It's going to be multiple step process. And no matter where you are in this process, whether it's beginning, middle, or end, there's always going to be room for growth, for improvement. So as we look at the technical transformation here, think about, there's going to be a lot of different perspectives on what is crawl, what is walk, and what is run, and certainly what is elite. But think about how you do this and grow from here and iterate from here. So with that, I'd love to open up to questions. I think I'm a little bit, I went through that just a drop faster than I had anticipated, but I'd love to see what kinds of questions are out there. And if there's anything that we can talk about from the perspective of culture, of adoption of DevOps, of what DevOps is and how it functions.
Hi, Yoni. Thank you for that great presentation.
Thank you.
We do have some questions coming in. First one I see is, what are the biggest challenges to shift to DevOps?
So that's a really interesting question. I think that when we look back and say, okay, what are some of the biggest challenges that we have? It's the shift in mentality. It's shift of how you think about your Salesforce environment. I mentioned the term monolithic earlier. I think that very much applies. There are moving from, when you start getting to the nuances of what DevOps on Salesforce implies, there's the ideas of developing package-based development, developing in Scratch orgs. Those are all ways of looking at Salesforce in much smaller chunks, much smaller ways. So moving away from that big monolithic thinking of your org and focusing more on incremental changes. The other big challenges is probably the fear of technology. As silly as that sounds in a group where we are all technologists, it's surprising how often we have people who are afraid of moving into or learning new technologies. I go back to the example of Git. That is something that we struggle with on an ongoing basis. The idea of Git, version control, branching, pipelines. Those are things that we have to learn. And in some respects, we can hide that from our declarative developers in some ways, but that's a big challenge that people have to embrace. And of course, there's always fear of change. I think I said at the beginning, but I like to think of change as a constant, that it's always going to be happening, but we definitely have a lot of that.
Great. And another question, what's the ROI on DevOps? So
there's going to be a lot of different perspectives on this. I think that defining the ROI on DevOps is an interesting challenge. I think you have some clear ones. It should be reducing the deployment time, right? You should see a significant reduction at the end of, once you've implemented the DevOps process in your organization, you should see reduced deployment time. You should also be seeing significantly reduced deployment issues. As I've been preparing for this presentation, I've been thinking a lot about 8 years ago, I'll never forget an entire night I spent doing a Salesforce deployment and how many issues there were that we had to fix one by one to get through the deployment. And it literally, I remember walking out of my office in the morning and being blown away by the complexity of that. But with DevOps, you reduce all of that. You bring in those issues and any challenges into the check-in process of the code, much earlier in the development lifecycle. So you're able to have a lot more reduced deployment issues. And then there's also just an increased confidence in your production environment, which I think allows your business stakeholders to focus on. We haven't talked too much about business stakeholders. We spoke a little bit at the beginning, but allow them to really focus on the business value we get from our systems rather than the systems themselves.
And we have quite a few questions coming in. Another one is, how much percentage is on tool versus process?
Oh gosh. Well, I mean, I don't think that there is a exact percentage, but I think the process and is vastly more important. Their tools obviously have to encourage that, but the percentage falls more on ensuring you have a good process. Because if you have great tools but terrible process, of course, we're always going to look at that. I mean, I think all of us as Salesforce developers know that, right? We look at our Salesforce orgs, they're amazing. Salesforce is an amazing tool, but if we screw up the process by which people use Salesforce, then of course everyone thinks poorly of Salesforce. So the same thing goes with DevOps. I think the process is more important than the tools, but obviously the tools have a real value.
And another one, someone had asked, can you please clarify what you mean by code is the source of truth?
Yes, I can. So, even in the Salesforce ecosystem, especially even in the Salesforce environment now, we're starting to see if you look at Salesforce DX and what that brings us, it brings us the ability to say, I want to take all of that environment and I want to put it in code and I want to put it into a version control system. And I want to create my orgs, my environments based off of what I have in my code repo, in my version control, rather than what is in the production org. And we have to change. Salesforce is changing their metadata, their APIs, to enable all of the declarative work that we've done to be represented in that code as well. So it's not that there's a distinction between the code, literally the Apex class, and the workflow rules. There's no distinction between those two things when I'm talking about code. But it's about extracting that from the actual environment of your production org and putting that in a code repo versus what is in the org itself.
Wonderful. Just reading through a bunch of these questions here. And the next one that I see is, if I have a master branch set up, how can I update installed packages every time?
Wow. Okay, that one's very detailed. If I have a master branch set up, how can I install packages? Well, so the first thing, it's a little hard to tackle that specific question, but I'll sort of describe one thing about DevOps using Salesforce and Scratch orgs and branching, which is one of the great things that you can do is scripting. And so when you are first enabling DevOps, I think there's a bit of overhead, especially when Salesforce orgs that are complex, that have packages installed or significant custom configuration. You have to put a little time and effort into the scripting of the installation of those processes. Now, it's not 100%. Salesforce has ways to go. I mean, when you start to look at some of the newer clouds and capabilities, there's challenges, definitely. It's not perfect, but more and more they're moving towards this. And I think if you invest the time upfront in scripting, you're going to be able to be a lot more effective in creating those orgs. So that's, I think, one of the key lessons that we've learned from doing this a lot, is focusing on that.
Wonderful. Well, we will make that our last question. Thank you all so much for participating. So many questions coming through. I'm sorry we don't have time to get to all of them right now, but we do want to move along to our next presenter. But I do want to say a big thank you to Yoni. Thank you for such a wonderful presentation and speaking with us today.
Thank you very much.